The sun was fading, stretching long orange fingers across the cobblestones of Royal Street. Inside the LaLaurie mansion, Evan and Mariah moved quietly, each step measured, almost reverent. The house seemed to sense them again, shifting its temperature subtly as they passed warm in some corners, unnaturally cold in others, a breeze that appeared from nowhere, brushing against the nape of the neck. Evan walked toward the grand staircase once more. He traced his fingers along the carved balustrade, noting the way dust had settled in the grooves overnight. It seemed deliberate. He caught himself imagining that the house remembered every touch, every footprint, cataloging their presence as though they were intruders stepping into someone else's diary. "Let's start upstairs," Mariah suggested softly, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous foyer. "We need to understand it." Upstairs, the hallway stretched long and narrow. The wallpaper faded to soft shades of sepia. The floorboards whispered beneath their feet, each creak deliberate. Evan noted the subtle differences from the night before. A floorboard that had groaned persistently now held steady, a shutter slightly ajar that had previously been closed tightly. The mansion was reacting. They entered the guest bedroom, the room where the door had mysteriously closed on the first night. Dust particles floated in the air, catching the pale light filtering through the tall windows. The bedspread had been slightly adjusted. Evan ran a hand over the pillow. It was warm, as if someone had just rested there. He swallowed. "It's like the house moved things for us," he murmured. Mariah nodded, frowning. "Or left us a message." The room fell silent, but the air hummed. Evan felt a vibration, subtle yet unmistakable, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. He stepped toward the closet. Something was off. The door was closed, but there was no knob on their side. It was latched. They had left it unlocked last night. "Did you hear that?" Mariah whispered. A soft scrape came from behind the walls, almost like someone dragging a chair, but far too light for the house's creaky floors. Evan strained his ears. Then came another sound, deliberate and slow, a faint tap-tap-tap, echoing from the hallway beyond. Evan's pulse quickened. He gestured for Mariah to stay behind and edged toward the source. The air grew colder, almost sharp, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the edges of the hallway. Each tap stopped just as he approached, resuming only when he hesitated. He turned back to Mariah. "It's testing us," he said, almost under his breath. "Testing? Like how?" "Not sure. Maybe our reactions, our courage, whether we respect it." They descended the stairs together, careful not to speak above a whisper. In the foyer, sunlight had diminished into a soft, golden glow. On the first step of the staircase, there was something new. A single, wet footprint, impossibly small for an adult, perfectly centered. It glistened faintly, reflecting the late afternoon light. Evan stared. He recognized the pattern from last night. It was deliberate, almost polite. Mariah gasped softly. "It's like it wants us to follow it." Evan knelt, examining it closely. The footprint led toward the dining room, stopping in front of the old wooden chair. The chair had shifted again, slightly rotated, angled toward the hallway. On the seat rested an old, yellowed envelope. They hadn't placed it there. With trembling hands, Evan opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in elegant, looping script. "Respect the past. Observe. Learn. Do not disturb." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The house was silent. Not the stillness of emptiness, but a quiet, deliberate pause, as if it were holding its breath. Mariah finally whispered, "It knows we understand." Evan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the mansion's awareness pressing against them, pressing in. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't violent. But it demanded something they hadn't anticipated. Vigilance, respect, and attention to the unseen. They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully walking each room, noting small details. Shutters closed slightly differently, doors nudged, dust patterns shifted. Every movement felt orchestrated. They weren't alone. The house wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was alive in its own way, observing, reacting, shaping them subtly, like a living memory. By evening, the mansion seemed to settle into a rhythm. It exhaled around them, letting them work, letting them move. But as night crept in and the moonlight touched the cracked balcony rails, Evan realized something unnerving. The house would not be content with casual observation. It wanted engagement, understanding, respect. And if they failed to give it what it required, they would feel it directly every night. As they prepared for bed, Evan glanced toward the hallway. Shadows stretched along the walls, elongated and deliberate. Somewhere above, a soft, measured creak echoed footsteps pacing slowly, purposefully, as if the house itself were walking its rounds. He whispered to Mariah, barely audible, "I think it's watching us tonight." She nodded, silent, wide-eyed, aware, and the mansion listened. Night had settled over New Orleans with an almost ceremonious weight. The street outside the LaLaurie mansion was quiet, the occasional distant horn of a cab or a soft laugh drifting up from the French Quarter. Inside, Evan and Mariah moved carefully through the foyer, their shadows stretching along the walls in strange, angular shapes. The house felt different at night. It wasn't louder. It wasn't violent. It simply existed around them, thickening the air, prolonging each breath, as though measuring their intentions. Evan ran his hand along the balustrade of the staircase again. The wood was cool to the touch, not the warm grain he had noticed during the day, and the grooves felt sharper, almost deliberate, as if every carved line had been accentuated just for him to feel it. He glanced up, and the upper hallway was swallowed in shadow, deeper than he remembered. Shadows pooled at the corners, stretching along the edges of the walls. Something about their stillness made him hesitate. Mariah followed quietly behind him, clutching a small flashlight. Its narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust particles that floated lazily in the heavy air. "Do you think it's aware of us again?" she whispered. Evan didn't answer. Instead, he listened. The subtle creak of a floorboard echoed from somewhere above them, slow, rhythmic, careful. Not a human pace, not the unsteady shuffle of a pet. Each step seemed to carry its own weight, deliberate, measured, precise. They paused at the landing. From above, the faint sound of the upper shutters moving reached them, a metallic click, delicate yet assertive. They hadn't touched the windows since that morning. Evan's hand twitched toward the railing, unsure whether to investigate or wait. Finally, Mariah said, "We need to see it, the source of the movement." Together, they climbed the staircase, each step a careful negotiation with the wooden boards beneath their feet. The hallway stretched unnaturally long in the dim flashlight beam, lined with doors on either side. Some were slightly ajar, some closed, perfectly flush. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, but perceptible enough to make the skin on the back of Evan's neck prickle. The guest room door, the one that had mysteriously closed days earlier, stood fully shut. Its brass doorknob gleamed faintly in the narrow light. Evan approached slowly, the air growing colder as he neared it. Not freezing, but sharp, crisp like stone. He rested a hand lightly against the door, noting the weight, the firmness. Felt intentional, purposeful. The house had closed it, and it remained closed, waiting. A soft noise came from the end of the hallway. A scrape, subtle, almost polite, wood brushing against wood. It was repeated once, then paused. Evan motioned for Mariah to stay back. He stepped forward, careful, listening. The air in the hallway shifted again. The subtle, measured creak of boards pacing above, maybe behind, he couldn't tell, continued. One step, pause. Another step, pause. And then a final, heavier creak closer to the wall across from him, as if someone had shifted their weight deliberately. He froze, straining to understand. Then a faint metallic clink, like a latch being lifted, echoed softly from the far end of the hallway. Not violent, not urgent, almost courteous. Evan swallowed, the taste of tension sharp in his mouth. Mariah's whisper reached him, small and careful. I don't want to go further. Not tonight." He exhaled slowly, turning to her. "I know, but we need to observe. That's what it wants. Observation." They retreated slowly down the hallway, their shadows lengthening and folding into the corners of the walls. The pacing above them stopped. The shutters ceased their faint rattling. For a moment, the house seemed to exhale, settling back into its long, quiet patience. Downstairs, the dining room chair, the one that had moved on its own before, sat undisturbed. The envelope from the morning lay open on the table, its message still stark and elegant: respect the past. Observe. Learn. Do not disturb. Evan touched it lightly, then let his hand fall. The message wasn't threatening, but it carried weight, like a reminder that they were not merely visitors. They were participants in something older, something aware. Mariah lit a candle, placing it on the mantelpiece. Its small, flickering flame cast dancing shadows across the walls, stretching and shrinking in rhythm with the air. They moved to sit on the floor, back against the old velvet sofa, neither speaking much. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the house hummed with subtle movements, almost imperceptible shutters shifting slightly, floorboards whispering tiny protests, the faintest tap-tap-tap returning from the upper hallway. They sat together, silent, listening, aware that the house had accepted their presence, but on its own terms. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't violent. But it had expectations. Every object, every shadow, every sound was a test, a quiet reminder that they were guests in a place that remembered everything, that measured every step, every breath. Hours passed. The flickering candle threw shadows that looked like they moved independently along the walls. The pacing above continued, subtle, distant, a rhythm of awareness. Evan finally whispered, "It's alive in its own way, not a person, not a ghost, but alive." Mariah nodded. "And it's teaching us how to be in it." They didn't speak again. They simply listened, aware that the house, patient and observant, would continue its quiet nightly rounds, waiting for them to learn its language. And outside, the streets of New Orleans slept, oblivious to the mansion that breathed, watched, and remembered everything. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The night deepened outside, wrapping the French Quarter in a dense velvet shadow. A lone street lamp flickered across the narrow cobblestones, throwing long, fractured patterns onto the wrought iron gates of the LaLaurie mansion. Inside, Evan and Mariah moved like cautious intruders, aware that the house had resumed its quiet rhythm of observation. The air carried a subtle weight tonight, heavier than before, as if the mansion itself inhaled and exhaled around them, measuring each movement, each glance. They stayed near the foyer, the small flashlight now nearly dim. Its beam danced across the polished wooden floors, catching the uneven patterns of age, and used the faint scratches, the worn corners of the banister, the subtle discolorations along the wall trim. Each imperfection seemed deliberate tonight, each shadow purposeful. Evan noticed a line of faint, shallow scratches along the baseboard near the staircase. They weren't there before. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Mariah leaned forward, her breath shallow. "It's like someone's been walking along there slowly, carefully, but not stepping hard enough to make a sound." Evan nodded, the sense of being watched creeping up his spine. They hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything substantial, and yet the house had made itself known. Not loudly, not violently, only insistently, quietly, like a teacher guiding a student through an invisible lesson. They ascended the staircase again, hesitant. The air above was cooler, sharp at the back of the neck, carrying a faint metallic scent, subtle but tangible. Each step was deliberate, measured. They paused at the top, listening. A soft scraping sound echoed from the hallway, followed by the quiet tap-tap-tap of what could only be footsteps pacing slowly toward the guest room. Mariah reached for Evan's arm. It's testing us again," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "We have to understand it. Just observe." The hallway stretched long before them. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in small corners, the pattern distorted by time and moisture. Light from the city outside filtered faintly through the tall windows, catching dust in the air, illuminating the subtle movements of the house. The doors along the corridor were in slightly different positions than they had been earlier, some closed, some open. Each adjustment seemed intentional. When they reached the guest room, Evan noticed a subtle shift in the door frame. The brass knob gleamed faintly in the dim light, as if polished recently, though they hadn't touched it. He placed a hand on it. It was cooler than expected. He turned slightly, noticing a faint outline on the floor, a pattern in the dust. Faint, like someone had traced a line across it carefully. The line led to the corner of the room where a chair rested, angled perfectly toward the window. Mariah bent down to inspect. "It's like it wants us to see it or follow it," she murmured. Evan traced the line with his finger. It stopped precisely at the base of the chair. The envelope from earlier, the one that had instructed them to observe and respect, was gone. Instead, on the seat of the chair lay a small, yellowed notebook, bound in cracked leather. The pages were blank except for a single sentence written across the first page in delicate, looping script. "Notice the details. They tell you everything you need to know." The sentence made Evan's chest tighten. The house wasn't making threats, nor was it hostile. It was instructing them, teaching them how to perceive it, how to coexist with its presence. A faint creak sounded from the hallway outside, and they froze. The pacing resumed, soft and deliberate. Evan glanced at Mariah. "We have to follow it," he whispered. "Slowly, carefully. Don't rush." Step by step, they moved, the line of dust beneath the floorboards guiding them almost imperceptibly. The mansion seemed alive in the silence. Shutters adjusted slightly with each passing second. Air shifted in unpredictable currents, and the faint tap of unseen footsteps traced them as they progressed. The house's memory was alive, watching, noting, approving every small gesture. When they reached the far end of the hallway, the pacing stopped. Silence settled like a tangible weight. A single chair had moved again, this time, toward the center of the hallway. Evan and Mariah stood, hearts pounding, knowing that the house was observing their reaction, studying their patience, and testing their respect. The candlelight flickered against the walls, stretching shadows unnaturally. Dust motes floated in the narrow beam of the flashlight, giving the hallway the appearance of something suspended in time. A soft sigh of air seemed to drift through the corridor, though no window was open. Mariah whispered, almost to herself, "It's alive, but not in the way we imagined. It's aware." Evan nodded. "And it's teaching us to be aware too. We have to learn its language." They stayed in that quiet, tense stillness for what felt like hours, observing, listening, feeling the house breathe around them. The mansion did not frighten them with violent or supernatural acts. It instructed, it guided, it communicated subtly in creaks, movements, and shadows. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the edges of the city, Evan realized something chilling. The house would never stop observing. Every night, every step, every moment of inattention would be noted. The LaLaurie mansion did not sleep. It existed in perpetual vigilance. And for Evan and Mariah, surviving its quiet tests was only the beginning. By the time dawn began to filter pale and thin through the tall windows of the LaLaurie mansion, Evan and Mariah were exhausted. Their bodies ached from moving cautiously through every corridor, from climbing stairs slowly, and from holding their breath whenever the house shifted around them. Yet neither spoke of leaving. The mansion had become a presence, neither hostile nor benign, but insisting upon acknowledgement. The foyer glimmered faintly in the early light. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, catching golden rays and revealing the layers of age in the floorboards. The smell of old wood, mixed with faint traces of mildew and the lingering scent of polished brass, was almost tangible. It seemed to hold stories, each scent like a memory embedded in the walls. Evan ran a hand along the balustrade, noting the subtle scratches and dents he had observed before. They were unchanged, yet somehow different, sharper in relief, as if the house itself had decided to remind him of its presence. Each groove, each chip told a story of time and use, and perhaps of observation. Mariah moved to the dining room. The chair that had been nudged into the hallway the previous night was back in its original place. The small envelope and notebook from before had been removed entirely. Instead, A faint indentation on the table suggested something had been resting there. It was impossible to say whether it had been a message left or merely the echo of a presence they had come to understand. The difference was subtle, almost academic. "Evan," Mariah whispered, voice hushed as though even speaking might disturb the house. "Do you think it's satisfied?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked around the vast room, the sunlight now catching the edges of the high windows and reflecting off the cracks in the plaster. The shadows were soft, but they lingered in corners, moving slightly with the faint drafts that had always been there. He thought of the pacing above, the gentle creaks, the subtle movements that had guided them all night. He realized then that satisfaction, if it existed at all, was not a human emotion. It was acknowledgement, observation. The house had watched them, and they had survived its scrutiny. That was enough. They ascended to the upper hallway one last time. Each door seemed quieter now, more stable. The guest room door remained shut, but Evan noticed that the frame had been adjusted slightly, perfectly flush. No drafts, no creaks. The house had completed its silent round. They were not intruders, and yet they were not owners. They had been students. A soft sigh of air moved through the corridor, barely perceptible, as if the mansion were exhaling. Evan caught a faint shimmer near the old chandelier, dust floating in a stray beam of morning light, sparkling like tiny motes of suspended history. For the first time, he didn't feel anxiety in that presence. He felt understanding. Not intimacy, not friendship, but the recognition of shared space, and the delicate balance required to inhabit it without disturbing the weight of what had come before. Mariah walked slowly to the stairwell, looking down into the foyer. The grand wooden banister gleamed in the sunlight, polished and smooth, each curve deliberate. She reached out and lightly touched the surface. Evan noticed a faint warmth radiating from the wood, subtle and almost imperceptible, as if the mansion itself had absorbed the touch and allowed it to remain. "You think it remembers everything?" she whispered. "I think it does," he replied. "Everything, every footstep, every movement, every intention." For hours, they continued their careful exploration, making notes, observing and respecting the mansion's rhythms. The house did not speak in words, nor did it act in overt ways. Its communication was subtle patterns, pacing, movements, shifts in air, and small changes in objects. Tested patience, focus, and perception. And, in the end, it allowed them to remain because they had observed without arrogance, respected without fear, and acknowledged without intrusion. As evening approached once more, they stood together in the foyer, gazing at the sprawling interior. The mansion was quiet now, settled into the rhythm of its own making. There was no creak above, no movement beyond the soft settling of the building itself. Only the faint hum of history, pressing against the walls, reminding them that nothing in this house was ever simple or still. Evan finally whispered, "We've learned how to be in it." Mariah nodded. "It's not ours, and it never will be, but we've survived its lessons." They turned to leave for the night, glancing back only once. The mansion seemed to exhale again, a subtle shiver in the air, and the faintest shadow shifted across the upper hallway. Not a threat, not a ghost, but a presence, patient and eternal, watching, remembering, waiting. And as they closed the door behind them, stepping into the quiet streets of New Orleans, the mansion remained behind unchanged, yet fully aware that it had been acknowledged. It was a house that remembered everything, a silent teacher of patience and observation, and in its quiet way, it had accepted them. The streets were calm, the city breathing normally, but the mansion, with its history, its weight, and its persistent presence, continued to live, to remember, and to test, forever patient, forever watching. And for Evan and Mariah, the LaLaurie mansion would never truly leave their minds. Its lessons were subtle, its presence persistent, and its quiet awareness eternal.